So, ladies and gentlemen, this session on translation starting now will be moderated by Uma Maheshwari Brugubanda. And Uma Maheshwari Brugubanda is an associate professor in the Department of Cultural Studies at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. She received her PhD in socio-cultural anthropology from Columbia University. Her major research interests are Indian cinema, cultural history, feminist theory, gender studies, and translation. She is the author of Deities and Devotees, Cinema, Religion and Politics in South India, and she translated and co-edited the book Vegetarians Only, Stories of Telugu Muslims. She has also translated some works of contemporary Telugu writers like Gogu Shamala, Muhammad Khadir Babu, Vinodini, and Challapalli Swaruparani. And I request Uma to introduce the speakers as quickly as she can because their bios are already in the tabloid. And then after, you can take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vijay Kumar. Thank you and the other organizers of the HLF for having given me this opportunity. It's a real pleasure. And I'm a little nervous and excited. Nervous because I'm not so familiar with your work, both of you. I've just started reading your work, Sawendra. But I'm excited because this has given me an opportunity to get to know your work and also for this conversation. So, as I have been asked to do, I will do a quick intro because there are more details available on the HLF website. So Aparna Uppaluri is a dancer, but also is an Odissi dancer, and but works in the field of philanthropy with a focus on gender, climate, health, and human services. And she's here today as part of the translation panel because her first translation of a complete volume of poetry from Oriya is going to be published soon. And it's called Rain Incarnations, Barsha Avatar. So we'll hear more about that. It's a real pleasure to have you on this panel. And Hansta Sowendra Shekhar, well-known author. But today I think we'll be focusing on your translations. Many of you know his works, The Adivasi Will Not Dance, his collection of short stories, and his two novels, The Mysterious Ailment of Rupi Baski, which came out in 2014, and My Father's Garden 2018. But his translation work, which came out in last year, is a translation of Manoj Rupda's Hindi novel Kale Adhyay, which he has translated as I Named My Sister Silence. And we are very fortunate to have Manoj also in the audience here. Looking forward to an interesting conversation with both of you. Let me start off, as I said, as we were chatting before the session, I'm going to start by asking both of you, what brought you to translation? We as Indians live between many languages. Each of us at least speaks 3, and I know that you also speak many languages, both of you. But then what brought you to translation? And what is the most exciting and most challenging part of translation for both of you? Shall we start with you, Aparna? Maybe you can use that word.
Thank you, Uma. Pleasure to be with you, Uma and Sawendra today. And thank you to the Hyderabad Literary Festival. I also want to acknowledge both Manoj and the poet Bishnu Mahapatra, whose work I translate, who is also here in the audience today. I think, we have to begin speaking about translation by thinking about our relationship with language. And it's interesting for me to be in Hyderabad, to be speaking about translation, because in a way, Hyderabad is where I was born, and Telugu is my mother tongue. But I never lived long enough in Telugu land to really make Telugu my own. I left when I was, barely 7 or 8 years old. And as I was sharing with you earlier, I've lived in 27 homes in my less than 50 years. So many languages have inhabited me, as much as I've had to inhabit many languages. So translation for me has been an essential part of getting to know myself, because my relationship with languages has always been mediated through translation. And I think an interesting anecdote I'd like to share with you is when I was in my early pre-teens, about 10 years old, my family lived in North Africa. And I went to school in a French medium school, and I'd never spoken French in my life before. So the languages I'd grown up with were English, Telugu, and a smattering of Hindi. I'd also grown up with Malayalam and Tamil. So by the age of 9, all of these languages were kind of swirling around inside me. And suddenly I found myself in a French school in a North African Arabic-speaking country. And for that was for the first time that I actually read Rabindranath Tagore in French translation. And I read Walt Whitman in French translation. Without translation, I don't think I would have been able to access what the import of that poetry was. And years later, when I actually tried to teach myself some Bengali and teach myself, other languages over a period of time, the magic of reading Tagore in French never left me. The idea that, the first time that the poem entered me, whether it was through the original or the translation, that magic was still there. And I became fascinated with this idea of translation. That in a way, sometimes we are all skeptical about translation. Can translation really carry what is there in the original? Sometimes we think that translation is a bit like a Trojan horse. There is a secret, and then it's sort of invading into the original. In fact, in Italian, traduttore and traditore, the traitor and the translator are almost seen as akin to each other in that sense. Italian's also a language that I ended up learning over a period of time. So translation to me is an invitation. And I think that's, because how do I make all languages my own? And translation became that medium of making all languages my own, when it was, in a globalized world, making one language yours is becoming increasingly difficult.
That's such a lovely story of so many living and growing with so many languages. Shavendra, now to you.
Thank you, Uma. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you all of you for coming to our session. Mr. Rupra is here, whose novel I translated. I grew up in a place called Maubhandar, which is at that small tip of land wedged between West Bengal and Odisha. My mother tongue is Santhali. I come from the Santhal community. Hindi, of course, it was everywhere. I went to an English medium school, so that was my mode of education. My parents, they worked in a place which was full of the people who we call Biharis. They spoke the language Bhojpuri, and so my parents picked up that too. And of course, the place was wedged between Odisha and West Bengal. Sorry, Odisha and West Bengal, I got the geography wrong. So there was Bengali and Odia as well in our household. So same here, I grew up with so many languages, and now I'm working with 1, 2, 3, 4 languages: English, Hindi, Santhali, and Bangla. Translation for me, it started as a joke. It was a game my cousins and I played when we were young, when we used to go to a village house, and we did not have, much entertainment. So what we used to do is we used to translate Hindi film songs into Santhali. But we did it as a joke, to have a laugh. It is now that I'm realizing that even though that started as a game, I think it was an important thing we did. Yes, because translation in any way, it is a transport of ideas from one people to another people. And this thought of translating, it hit me when I was in plus 2, in standard 12. We had the story Vapsi by Usha Priyamvada, one of Usha Priyamvada's very famous stories. So that was in our plus 2 syllabus. And when I read it, I had this feeling that maybe one day I will translate this. Maybe one day. This was in 1999 or 2000. And I finally translated that story, and it was published in 2022. Or was it 21? I think 22, in online on the website of the Indian Express. And I read Mr. Rupla first in the year 2006. It was a Hindi magazine called Vagarth, published out of Calcutta, published by the Bharatiya Bhasha Parishad. And I read his story, a very longish story called Tower of Silence, which was in Hindi. Mr. Rupla is from Nagpur, but that story was set among the Parsis of India. So, in that way, that story was, covering a lot of things. And then I felt that, yes, I have to translate this story as well. And then I translated it again in 2022. In 2023, it was published. And during that time, I got Mr. Rupla's novel, Kale Adhyay. And at that time, I was translating from Bangla. Mr. Nalini Bera's novel, Shubhana Renu Shubhana Rekha. But yes, I started translating quite long ago. I think I started with translating the poems of, or was it a non-fiction piece? I think it was a non-fiction piece in Santhali by a poet, author, school teacher named Shibu Tudu, based in Pakur in Jharkhand. I was based in Pakur at that time in 2016. And that work was published in Asymptote Mag, the online magazine Asymptote. And then I translated, I think, Parimal Hansta's poems from Santhali to English, and they came in Scroll. And then I translated Mr. Manish Mundra, the film producer from Dishyam Films. His poems from Hindi to English, they came in Hindu. So this is, and yes, I translated Mr. Ranendra Kumar's very long story, which was published in Usawa, the online literary magazine. It was from Hindi to English. So this has been my translation journey so far.
No, so for both of you, therefore, Aparna, so you've talked about so many languages that were part of your life. But then how did you come to, translating specifically Oriya to English? That's something that I'd like you to talk a little bit about.
My relationship with Odia didn't start with the language, but my relationship with Odia poetry began with a friendship with the poet. So I think there are two tracks to the story, and I have to acknowledge the generosity of the poet in allowing me to sort of enter his poetry when a language wasn't, again, fully my own. But, I've been practicing Odissi dance from the age of 14. So the language actually entered me through the imagery and the movement. So Odia for me became first an embodied language through movement, even before it became a cognitive language that sort of just conveyed meaning through the symbols of words. And so, so I think I approached Odia really with the kind of reverence with which I approached my art. That reverence is not necessarily just a spiritual and religious reverence, but really the reverence towards the language, which then carries with it, stories of pain and joy and laughter and all of that, but also recognizing that there is context to language, that the way in choreography, the way you would show a gesture, and how the word that is sung with that movement then begins to play inside your body, So Odia, my relationship with Odia became very much through image and movement rather than just the cognitive piece. And it was after years of practicing Odissi that I actually came across the poetry of Vishnu Mahapatra, which is, again, poetry that's full of image and movement. And so in a way, I think the similarity between the choreography and the choreography of language that I saw in the poetry became sort of the primary entry point into the poetry for me, which is very different than, I think, many ways that a translator, approaches language. So for me, I think both dance, movement, and text and their interplay played a very important role.
That's really interesting to hear, and it's a beautiful way of thinking about of how one inhabits different languages differently. So for many, usually the translator's own language, but in your case, Shawendra, Santali is your mother tongue, but you also grew up with Bengali and Hindi, so you are translating from 3 different languages into English. So one question I have first, I will ask you and then again go back to Aparna is, what is it that you find most exciting about this process? And also, what is it that you find most challenging about it? Especially because you're doing it from 3 different languages.
The most exciting thing is the discovery of that particular work. Like, for example, when I read Usha Premadaji's story so many years ago in school, Vapsi, I knew that this is a story which could be translated. Like when I read Mr. Manoj Dupra's work, Tower of Silence, I knew that it could be translated. And that I had to somehow. So that discovery of that one work, that is so exciting. It is like, wow, we have found a treasure, really. Also, another exciting thing, and which also is the most challenging, is being able to take the spirit of the original work in its original language into that other language into which it is being translated. And this I realized while I was translating a few Santhali poems for Poetry at Sangam website, which has unfortunately shut down now. It has a lovely archive though. So it was Mr. Parimal Hansta's poem, which I was translating for them. Parimal Hansta, he is based in West Bengal, and he's a school teacher. And he won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2016 for his book of poems. And in that particular poem, he writes about a flower, which I realized, I Googled, I saw that it was an ordinary flower. So what was in that flower that made the poet write that poem? And then he told me the significance of that particular flower and why he was so impressed. And then I realized that in order to translate, we do not just need to translate the words, okay, from one language to the other language. We may sometimes need to make that journey into the mind of the author, because what is special for the author may not be special for you, for the translator, right? We may enjoy that author's works, but sometimes our wavelengths, they don't match. So we, yes.
I miss the significance of
Yes, the
what
nuances of it.
Yeah.
Like what makes that particular thing so special to a writer that they need to, they had the need to write about it. So that is one thing which is challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, so let me ask this other question I had. You can talk about it and then we'll come to Aparna. And because your authors are also here, so how much closely do you work with the author in the translation? Because do you only stick with the text or do you have conversations with the author? This is more about the nitty-gritty, the practice of translation, but I'm sure many of us would be interested in hearing about, do you think that is a necessary part of the craft of the translator? To actually sit down and talk with the author, work with them, or like, how do you go about it?
This may shock you, but I do not consult the author at all.
Okay.
I try to express that, but the original work as my own work.
Okay.
Because only then will I be able to work independently, work without any shackles, work without any expectation. So yes, I come to the author when I've completed the translation, or when I'm stuck somewhere. Like while translating Parimal Hansa's poem, I was really stuck. This flower is an ordinary flower. What made you write a poem on it? So if there's a situation like that, I ask the author. Otherwise, no.
Okay.
Otherwise, I come at the end of it. Because see, it is not the author's duty to explain the story to the readers in another language. It is the translator's duty. So the translator has to understand the text first. And the translator cannot go on asking the author, why did you write this? The translator has to, interpret that by themselves.
No, what I had in mind was that the context in which they write. For example, your own stories, the Adivasi will not dance. Now, if I'm translating it into another language, but I should know enough about the context within
Yes.
which this work is
Yes.
born,
Yes.
and without that I will not be able to get some of the nuances or the importance or the significance of some of the.
Yeah. In one way, I have been lucky in this regard because I started with translating from Santhali. So that context I know. Mr. Rupra's novel Kali Adhyay was set among the Koitur people. So they are I think the second largest Adivasi community in India. So I was familiar with some of those things as well. There was some mention of trees and all which I could not understand, so I looked up on the internet first.
Oh.
And then I asked Mr. Rupra. And the other book which I have translated, Nalini Bera's novel, Bengali novel Shubhana Renu Shubhana Rekha into English, and which is in the submission stage right now. So that book, it tells the story of people who live beside the river Subarnarekha as it makes its way into the Bay of Bengal. And this place is on the border of southern West Bengal, I think it is Jhargram district now, and northern Odisha. So they speak a language called Hatwa, which is a mix of both the colloquial Bengali of that area as well as Odia.
Okay.
So, and the people who have been mentioned in that, like there are people from the Mahato caste, there are people from the Santhal community.
Right.
So I am familiar with their lives. So I think I have been fortunate in that regard that I have chosen books which somehow spoke to me, which I somehow could connect with.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
yes.
Right. Thank you. Aparna.
It's two parts, right? What excites me about translation, and so I think the most exciting thing about translation is the choice making for me, because there are always so many possibilities in translation. To render meaning, to be evocative, to aim to bring across what the poem did to me to the reader as well. I'm very fortunate to be able to work with the poet. I think unlike Saurendra, I work very closely with the poet. In fact, one of the things that I often ask him to do is to keep reading the original to me as much as possible, because listening to the sound of the original in Odia is something that I find very important, because I think there is also, with poetry, something that's pre-linguistic and not just about the meaning of the word, but the feeling that is evoked when you hear it. And Odia is an extremely lyrical language, and I'm trying to translate it into English, which for many of us is also a very technical language. And so really to listen to the alliterations, to the effect of the poem. And so there it isn't just about learning about the context and the meaning, but really what is it that the poem evokes in me? When I stand apart from the poem, what does it do to me? When I'm done reading it, what is the feeling that I'm sitting with, and how can I bring that across in the work? So these kind of choices is what sort of really keeps me very excited. The challenge, of course, is that this fine line that you walk between translation and transcreation, which is what our session is called, is how much liberty do I take? How loyal do I remain to the original? And I often, make the mistake of going back and asking the poet, and he says, once I've written the poem, now it's yours, right? The poet, is done with the poem, and so now it's yours. And I often don't get help there, but I get a lot of help in being able to hear it over and over again in the original. And I think that is very essential for me in the process of translation. So I think I've given you the sense of.
So that brings me to another question that I had. So since I'm also into the theory of translation as a teacher and a scholar, so one of the theories of translation says that a translator should retain some of the original flavor. In fact, the work should not be so domesticated into English or whatever other language that it is being translated that you don't realize it's another language. So that foreignness of the source language should somehow be perceptible in the translation. And Aparna, you were talking about the sounds, especially in poetry, and Sauvendra, you said you were also translating poetry. So how much of this do you keep in mind, in the sense that how do you capture the original Santali or the Bengali? And sometimes in many languages, sometimes there's a mix of of both, in a Hindi novel, I'm sure there would also be, some English, some. So how do you capture the original in the sounds, or what of it do you try to retain in your translation? Maybe we could start with you, Aparna.
Sure, thank you, Ma. I think it is important to accept that not everything is translatable, right? And I think that's the place from which I would begin in this question of, do you domesticate every sound, every language into the target language, in a sense. So the choice making is dictated by, many different things. Like, for example, Odia is a language that doesn't have gender pronouns. So if there is a personification that is happening in that language, then I have a choice to make in what gender do I attribute. If the poet has written about rain in a language where there are no gender pronouns, do I personify it as a woman? So there are those kinds of choices also to be made. And so then the domestication becomes a challenge because it's not possible. So then I have to choose, what sits with me politically and not just poetically. So that kind of choice making happens. But very often I like to just use transliterated words because it's important to carry through that there is a mystery. I cannot carry everything over from one language to the other. And allowing some of that mystery to remain, I think, is also part of a good translator's job. And, leave the effort a bit to the reader as well, so that there is again a relationship that is being created between the reader of the translated work as well. Yes.
I think I will echo what Aparna said. When something is going wrong, whether it is in writing an original work or translating a work, you come to know about it. It is an instinct that yes, this is not going in the right way. Okay, and that is when you try to correct it or revise it. So yes, it has happened with me, and I think I have done my revisions at the proper time. Also, like Aparna said, even Santhali does not have gendered pronouns, right? So this was a difficulty which I faced while translating a poem by Suchitra Hansda. She's a poet. She's based in West Bengal, and she won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in the year 2015 for Santhali, the same year in which I won for English. And we met in Delhi, and we have been in touch ever since. So I also translated Suchitra Hansda's poem for the Sangam, the Poetry at Sangam website. And there was a poem in which she has imagined the Almighty. Okay, no problem. So there is a poem in which she has imagined the Almighty as a flute player. Yeah. So it was symbolic, like the way a musician plays tunes on their instrument. In the same way, for God, for the Almighty, we are like musical instruments, and then they play us. So now in our Santhali, there are no gender pronouns. So the Almighty was called Chando Bonga. Bonga is God, of course. So now when I'm translating it into English, I'm like, what should what should God look like and what should the flute player talking about look like. Okay. So then I asked Suchitra, sister, tell me, how do you imagine God to be? Okay, is God a man or a woman? And she told me, brother, uh, this is creation, and God has created all of it. And who creates in our world? It's the woman who creates. So perhaps God is a woman. Whatever gender you choose for God, it's okay. But I think God is a woman. She told me, and I was like, wow. Okay. So, however, in that poem, there were two parts. One was the actual human flute player, and the other was God. So I got my answer for God that I will portray God as a woman. But in our social gatherings and all, I have seen that it is men, Santhal men, who usually play the flute. So the human flute player, I placed him as a man, while the God, the Almighty, I placed her as a woman. So those are some modifications we have to make, and we have to consult with the author. It is basically like when we are stuck, it becomes what you call it, a concerted effort. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think we are in the last 5 minutes of our conversation before we open it out to the audience. So I'm going to ask, quick two questions. One is, like I said, again thinking about languages. Have you ever thought of, earlier I think, now this may be a diminishing tribe of people, but earlier there were lots of active translations between Indian languages, say from Odia to Bengali or Telugu to Tamil, or so now when we say somebody is bilingual or multilingual, English is inevitably one, and the other will be their mother tongue and Hindi, or so English today sort of is the dominant language, and both of you translating from Indian languages into English. Have you ever thought about this, or are you also thinking of translating between Indian languages themselves? That is one thing. And then I also want you to quickly tell us what your current translation projects are, because that will be something we will all look forward to. Yeah.
Thank you, Uma. I mean, it goes without saying that English has now become the via media for all of us. I mean, even for me to access poetry from other languages, I will tend to go to an English translation first. But I think the effort to learn to read in the original is something that, to find the resources to do that, I think as a culture, as a community, and that a community that lives with multiple and shared languages, I think there is value in sort of inculcating that. But at the same time, I'm also sort of moving away from this idea of English being an imported language. I know that we've been, we've all been talking about this for nearly 100 years. And I think we've managed to domesticate English to a fair degree. But I think the important part for me, while English remains a via media, is how much I use my knowledge of other Indian languages while I'm translating from Odia to English. How much the idioms in Telugu, in Tamil, in Kannada actually inform my translation from Odia, because there is that comparative piece that is happening. The role that idiom plays in language is something that is lost when the language gets lost. And so without idiom, what is language, right? And I think, so for me, it's not just sort of loyalty to the language itself, but the role that is, that's beyond, that's cognitive, but also beyond the cognitive. And so, I would really advocate that we continue to access other languages as much as possible, and not just sort of say that, it isn't good enough that we only translate to English, but how much does the interplay of languages actually inform our relationship with, one or the other of the Indian languages. And yeah.
Okay, so this year's Hyderabad Lit Fest has Odia as its focus language. And one of the first, and this reminds me, one of the first stories that I read in translation was actually from Odia into Hindi. This again was in school. The Hindi story was called Punarjanam, and it was written by Jadunath Dash and translated from, it was, I think, an Odia story and translated from Odia into Hindi by Rajendra Prasad Mishra. So, yes, it was useful for me, the translation from Bhasha into Bhasha. But yes, it's also a fact that most of the translations that I read, whether from an Indian language or from a foreign language, it was in English. And maybe that's the reason why I'm currently translating into English. Also, there's a children's book of mine, Sumi Budhi Aur Sugi, published by Pratham Books, which I myself translated into Hindi. So maybe I'll translate further into other languages. Maybe I'll try. I cannot say for now. And one book which I translated, as I told all of you, it is by Nalini Bera, his Ananda Purashkar winning novel, Subhanu Renu Shubhanu Rekha. It's in submission stage right now, and I look forward to translating more of Mr. Manoj Dupla's works. So that is, hopefully all of it is done.
Thank you so much. You didn't say anything about your other current projects.
Yes, so it's two main current projects. One is a book that we're expecting to come out of translations of Barsha Avatar by Bishnu Mahapatra, the poet who's here. He has a session later this afternoon. So in translation in English, it's going to be called Rain Incarnations, and it's about 40 poems on rain. They're meditations on rain. And it's been an incredibly exciting journey to translate this because the poet imagines rain in every possible way, from being a detective to an activist to an avadhuta. So it's rich with metaphors and images, but also it's a political commentary on our time. So I'm really very excited about that publication. And the other collection that I'm working on are another set of poems that have been written about the mythological character of Amba from the Mahabharata. So those are the two projects underway right now.
Thank you very much. Now we will open out the session for questions from the audience. I think we have roughly 7 to 8 minutes. I see a hand up there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to know how you deal with the advent of technology, especially talking about artificial intelligence and what it can do, especially with things like translation. We have already things like Google Translate. And how do you see that, as translators?
There was another question here. Maybe we will take that also and then. The gentleman in the green shirt. And then we will come to you.
Okay, this is to Aparnaji. The question that I have is more in terms of when you are translating, the author's expression, the original author's, the emotion part of it, how do you capture that? Because, particularly from, let's say, from Odia to English, you may not have all the necessary words, so it must be a challenge. So the author's emotions per se, how do you capture, and what kind of a mental, intellectual process that you go through? Maybe you want to highlight that. Yeah.
Shall we take those two questions? Then we will come to you. Yeah?
AI is a dangerous thing, and I hope we do not give in to AI. I just hope. No one can beat, who created AI? I think humans created AI, so nothing can beat the human brain and human capability. I just hope we humans do not, are not defeated by machines. That's it.
Yeah, I'd like to think about the practice of a translator as another form of resistance as well. This AI can do now, I hear it can make paintings, it can replicate absolutely every, the aim seems to be to replicate every possible human activity. But, as I said, and I just come to the second question, is and this is what I learned from working, being able to work so closely with the poet, right? I have access to be able to go back and ask the poet, what is the emotion you felt? What evoked this expression? But I think the pushback that I get from the poet is to say, what did it do to you? Right? And so I think a translator has to straddle that space between what I imagine the poet would have meant and what it made me feel. And it's that negotiation and then that choice to say, do I really push to move from one language to another what the poet might have felt or what it made me feel? And it's not always consistent, right? It really is an intuitive process at one level.
We see quite a few translations from English to Telugu, be it poetry or novels, but why isn't it happening as much the other way around, from Telugu to English? I mean, I can only ask about my language, but generally, why not as much the reverse traffic?
We'll take another question and then.
So my name is Sandhya and I'm a two-month-old debut author. So I've just written a book called Shifting Sands of Saudi. Now this is an expat account of life in Saudi Arabia. So immediately within the first 2 months, the feedback that's coming is, why don't you translate your book into Arabic or Malayalam, because a lot of people travel from here, and Tamil or Hindi as well, right? So from an author's point of view, when do I start thinking about wanting to translate the book, or will a translator approach us, or should we wait for some time for the English book to gather steam? So I wanted to know from that point of view what it is. Thank you.
If it's possible for you to translate in any of these languages, you can do it yourself as well.
Hindi, yes.
Yeah,
I
you
can think so.
You can.
Yeah.
Because I think an author is the best person to translate because the story has come from the author.
Right.
Right. So
But the other languages?
other languages, eventually they will come. As your book receives more visibility, as more people start enjoying it, so you may get proposals, you may get offers for
So I
translation.
just wait.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Really
Publishing requires patience. That is what I have learned so far.
Okay.
Sometimes the patience may, it may go on for one year,
I
and
have
1.5
a lot of
year.
patience. So
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Thank you so much for
That's
this.
it,
A
yeah.
very useful session.
But if you can translate it yourself, then it's the best.
It's the best.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. I think you've asked a very political question also, in a sense. By political, I don't mean, because it's a little bit, I say political because it has a lot to do with the power of language, and the idea that there is more translation happening from English into Telugu than Telugu into English. I mean, I'm a Telugu speaker, native Telugu speaker. But my facility of being able to really say that I've made Telugu my own, to be able to, do that translation is, again, for me, because of my relationship with the poet in Odia and that access, it gave me that confidence. I'm giving you a very personal answer, right? But I do feel, yesterday we were having a conversation with a friend who was saying that in Telugu, today in Telugu land, many of us don't know our own writings that have been written in Telugu. Forget about sort of, but contemporary writers in Telugu. How many of our school children know who's writing in Telugu? What is being written? So I think that, unless that shifts, I think this idea that there is something in this language that should be carried over to English, which is a more mainstream language, that desire has to be evoked, I think, but for that I have to have the knowledge, have the ownership, have the sense of being steeped in it. And I myself, I'm guilty of it. I myself feel like I don't know enough. So it's, but I appreciate your question. I think it's very important that we put it out there and ask ourselves this question. Why is it not happening? What needs to change in order for it to happen? But, you've motivated me. Thank you.
Okay, one last question, then we'll have to end. Yeah, at the back. Sorry, sir. There was one there. And
Thank you for the session. I had a question which is sort of meta. Like, are there works that you think like it shouldn't be translated, or every work needs the transfer of information has to happen? And the follow-up to that is like, is there something as like who gets to translate the work, or is like because like the reason I'm asking this is like New Zealand tribe basically blocked the AI tools from using their languages for translation purposes. So yeah. So your thoughts on this?
Should everything be translated or?
Yes, I think everything should be translated. Everything should be translated. Everyone must know everything. And also, who's the best person to who's the best translator to translate? I mean, every work needs a champion. Like, I think I might also speak to this lady in front who asked the question about Telugu to English translations. Every work needs a champion, and that champion has to be there at some position of power. Only then can we push. Some amount of power is needed in every sphere. We know that. We know that. Power, money. I'm being too honest, I think. But yes, we need champions who have power and who have money. Okay? And then certainly they will get translated. Also, the person who is translating, they should feel about that particular work. Like most of the works which I've translated so far, be it Mr. Rupala's book or his story, or be it Mr. Nalini Behra's book, I felt for those books. Those books spoke to me. But yes, once you are established, you will get commissions. Like people will ask you to translate. And then you have to choose. Am I feeling enough for this particular book? Am I feeling enough for this particular story? Will I be able to translate it? Okay, so that is my answer.
I agree. I think every text deserves to be translated. I mean, I don't think anyone can make a judgment and say, this shouldn't be translated. But in Barshavatar, which is the volume that I've translated, there are about 2 or 3 poems that I left out. I wasn't able to translate everything because there were a couple of poems where I felt I wasn't up to the task. But there was one particular poem that I really wrestled with because I loved the poem and I wanted very badly to translate it, but I struggled. It took me almost a whole year to do it, But it's something that you have to feel for, that you'll be willing to put in the effort for, but you begin from the place that yes, every author's work, every poet's work, if you care about it, deserves to be translated.
I think we will end there. As moderator, I was told I have to stick to time, and I think I've more or less done that job. But I thank you both. It was a really enriching conversation, and what I learned, this has been said before, but it came across again freshly to me, that the translator is the first kind of reader, is firstly a reader who enjoys the text, who feels passionately that this should travel to another language, that they are very keen that others should read it and it should reach a wider audience. And I think that is the main sort of push, that pushes one to translate it and take it into another language. Thank you both. I really enjoyed this conversation with both of you, and I hope you did too, and thank you all.